Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to the Rich Podcast, a podcast dedicated to preventing targeted violence. This is a safe space where we share insightful discussions and strategies about violence prevention. I am Dr. Yok Fong Pat, a team member of the Rich Project. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Domestic terrorism are acts of violence committed by individuals or groups to further their radicalized religious, political, racial, social, or environmental ideologies and have serious repercussions to the national security and well-being of our community. Joining us today is Dr. Erik Cruz. Dr. Cruz is an assistant professor of criminal justice at the Florida Memorial University in Miami Gardens in Florida. Good afternoon, Dr. Cruz. Thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So most of my research focuses around looking at the environmental and social determinants of crime and deviance, typically from a macro perspective, but I also do some work at the micro level as well.
Thank you. From your perspective, what is domestic terrorism and how does it differ from other forms of terrorism?
Sure. So domestic terrorism refers to acts of terrorism within a specific country, and those are acts that are carried out by an individual or a group of people who reside within that country. It typically differs from what most people colloquially refer to as terrorism in three distinct ways: location, nationality, and motives. So firstly, with the location, these are people who are typically targeting other fellow citizens or the institutions that they share. So these are people who live near them. People might live in the same country, same state, or a different state, but they're still targeting the same people that reside within that country, and also the institutions. So these are people that either are in government or serve as proxies of the government. So think of things like police officers or peace officers. Number two, nationality. These are people who primarily were born in these countries. So they're perpetrating acts against the imagery of the government in which they grew up basically supporting, or that the people who raised them. And lastly, for motivations, these are policies, politics, social issues that people feel passionate about, but they're passionate about domestically. So in most instances, when people think of terrorism, they think of terrorism internationally, which referring to like people who disagree with the acts of another government. With domestic terrorism, these are people who disagree with their own government.
Thank you. How widespread do you think the occurrence of domestic terrorism is?
Sure. So domestic terrorism is pretty difficult to gauge, and that's because there's not like a well set up repository that's coded to say this is domestic terrorism, this isn't. The best thing that we have currently available is the Global Terrorism Database, or GTD, that typically is referred to. It does a really good job. It's very meticulous, but it is also difficult to collect data for. So right now they're up to around year 2020. So if you look over the last 10 years at the United States, most of the incidences would likely be coded as domestic terrorism. And of those attacks that were reported, roughly around 520-ish attacks in the United States. It does vary by time, by political administration. So even though I mentioned that there's roughly around 50 terrorist attacks a year over the last 10 years, 75% of those attacks actually happened over the past 5 years. So basically, right at the beginning of the Trump administration, there was a rise of terrorist attacks in the United States, particularly far right wing, and a bit of also an uptake of Islamic coded terrorism, but typically those two. If you look at it from a global perspective, the United States on the global stage is really low on the occurrences of terrorism list. The regions that suffer from terrorism the most are typically the Middle East and North Africa. Then it's South Asia, then it's Sub-Saharan Africa, then it's like the northern part of South America.
This seems concerning. What are the common factors that lead to the acts of domestic terrorism?
Sure. So a lot of the acts of terrorism are typically associated with I call them like categorical beacons of grievance that have to do with disenfranchisement, like locally. So the first one that I usually call is political grievances. So if you feel disenfranchised or you feel angered by your government, the policies in any meaningful way, I don't want to say you're likely to commit terrorism, but these are the most commonly cited reasons. Next would be social discontent. So if you feel alienated, isolated, or marginalized in any meaningful way, still very similar to political grievances. That's also another precursor. Economic instability, right? So economic hardship, perceived economic injustices, are all like pretty good breeding grounds for radicalization. It's probably worth mentioning that when people talk about these things, they use different proxy measures for it. I've seen studies where people use gross domestic product, people use the unemployment rate, people use the labor force participation rate. What all these studies typically find is that there's no one perfect measure for like the factors that bleed into domestic terrorism, but that all of them combine together. So like what we find is that countries that typically have bad economic conditions, that have a lot of political grievances, that have high levels of social discontent, and that also have a lot of ideological beliefs that are genuinely different, that are different that people actually believe in, not geopolitically different, but like actually believe. Those are the places where domestic terrorism is most likely to thrive.
From your perspective, what are the roles that different extremist ideologies play in domestic terrorism?
Different ideologies they play a very important role in domestic terrorism because they are the guiding forces for these actions. So the way I like to look at it is these are like the political parties for the people. So instead of being like a small d Democrat or a small r Republican, these political ideologies essentially give answers to questions that people didn't know existed. They tell people what to do, what to think, and how to feel. And they do that by finding something that they largely agree upon and then extrapolating them out afterward. It's basically doing reducto ad absurdum, like taking it to the very end of the like extreme. So if you look at interviews of people who identify as white supremacists, very often they are people who genuinely believe that of the racial and ethnic superiority of their group over another group. But if you really, really talk to them, aside from that prejudicial view, they will also say things like, I feel like my group is being marginalized. I feel like my group is trying to be replaced. Now, other people may have that same sentiment, but they don't push it to that very far extreme. There are some people who feel radicalized, and very often it is the grievance, the economic and the social grievance that then gets pushed outward, and then the violence tends to be pushed in afterward. Same thing with anti-government, leftist style grievances, religious, they all have the same themes there, whereas they have some grievances that then grow into other ones.
Can you explain the radicalization processes and give us some examples of how individuals are typically radicalized to become involved in domestic extremist groups?
Sure. So with regards to radicalization, there's no like one process that everyone follows uniformly, but like vaguely, it typically happens in like 4 stages. The first one would be pre-radicalization. Essentially, individuals have grievances and they have not really yet adopted the extremist beliefs yet, but they do have some underlying beliefs, some underlying feelings that they feel may not be met by the society that they live in. Then they go to self-identification. This is when the extremists start to immerse themselves within the actual extremist ideology, or at least they're starting to get antiquated with it. The indoctrination part is when they fully start to embrace it. They immerse themselves in it. And then lastly, when they adopt the most extreme version of that belief, that's when they get to the action phase. A good example of this would probably be the Boston bombers, particularly the older brother, Tamerlan. He was someone who did have he's a pretty good example of what most people would strive to for the American dream. He came to America at a very young age. He was 8 years old, got into Dartmouth, was captain of his wrestling team. By all measures, he was killing it. But what ended up happening was in the first year of his life, he struggled a little bit academically. His parents got a divorce and his family at home, because his family was from Dagestan. And he also had a family that were basically being arrested for like charges related to terrorism or just like anti-government related activity. And when he wrote his appeal letter to Dartmouth, which is public, he actually said, I lost a lot of people this year. A lot of my family's being wrongly imprisoned, and the world's basically not fair. When he went back home, he went from the pre-radicalization stage to the self-identification stage, because what ended up happening was he started to meet groups of people who had these extremist narratives and beliefs. He went from someone who believed it slightly to started to embody it. He picked up new value system, or rather reinforced the value system that he knew he sort of had, but dove into the worst parts of it, particularly with martyrdom. He realized that that was his path forward, because the American dream that he knew and loved was no longer there. He got into the indoctrination part, and then eventually he adopted those beliefs. And what made it even worse was that he also brought his younger brother along for the ride.
Okay. What are the social, economic, and political factors that are linked to the rise of domestic terrorism?
Sure. So the social factors typically, at least in my mind, do center around this idea of disenfranchisement alienation, isolation, all things that remove people from the larger portions of society and put them in smaller buckets, socially anyway. That is what tends to be the breeding ground. Economically, economic instability, joblessness, perceived economic injustice. These are all things that people are very passionate about, and they're passionate about it for a reason. And lastly, political polarization, anything that has to do with an extremist rhetoric, anything that someone can basically attach themselves to and feel that their disenfranchisement is being heard tends to have a radicalizing power. So, for example, just looking at the economic one, and I do want to preface this by saying that these categories are not mutually exclusive because, as I said before, a lot of these extremist ideologies are one-stop shops for like action, beliefs. So what ends up happening is you can live in a country like America where, you know, by all like objective measures, it's a pretty wealthy country, right? Your average person has more income here than in most other countries. However, if they see economic injustice, if there's a lot of relative deprivation here, or even absolute deprivation, you can have people who have, you know, middle-class jobs that still want to see massive changes within the government, even to the point where they're willing to break the law because they feel an injustice is happening. Right. So it's not only an economic thing, although it can be an economic thing. All these things bleed together.
What are the roles that social media plays in the spreading of extremist ideologies and organizing of domestic extremist groups?
Social media is the megaphones for these groups. Social media built the rails that these groups use. It made it extremely accessible. There's that old expression that the internet made the world flat, in the respect that it takes a shorter period of time to get from point A to point B. That's social media, but on steroids. Social media, these companies are marketing companies, so the people using the platform are products. They are not the clients. And what ended up happening is they found out the best way to make money off these people, right? These companies, is to increase engagement. You increase engagement by increasing outrage and getting people interested to constantly come back. So what ends up happening, people produce echo chambers. People produce propaganda, and they have these excellent tools for recruitment and coordination. And the best part about it is these social media companies are typically not being held responsible. They will do whatever they can in their power to do the bare minimum to not be brought up by Congress to say, you know what, you guys are going to be regulated. They're going to be like, no, we are not content creators. We are content facilitators. So we don't actually have to do anything. What is the downstream effects of that? They don't have to be held responsible for the content, or at least most of the content anyway, that is being shared on their platforms. So they essentially made it very easy to meet someone with very specific demographics. So if you are someone who wanted to market like a brand new mountain bike, you can find very easily the people who look at like bikes on the internet, the demographics, people most likely to buy bikes, who goes outside, all the covariates. You can also find the groups of people who are most likely to be susceptible to a message regarding radicalization. And the best part about it is you can pay Facebook to do that for you. You don't even have to do it yourself.
So from what you have seen, what are the strategies that have been effective in preventing domestic terrorism? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So community engagement is probably the most potent tool that we have. There's a lot of things that go into it. So like counter messaging, sharing of intelligence, getting people on board to pass certain legislation. It all bleeds into the idea that if law enforcement and like public figures are involved and telling the community at large, this is what we're trying to prevent, and this is why, that typically seems to be the best answer. Counter messaging is extremely important. I'm not saying to fight slogans with slogans. You're never going to be able to convince people who are already seduced by the ideas of like radical terrorism or basically domestic terrorist groups. You're probably not going to be able to like convince them just with like one or two liners. But if you say something to someone like you see something, say something, right? Like that slogan sounds very simple, but it fights against our natural inclination to be susceptible to the bystander effect. It makes people feel accountable for the block that they live on. The best tools that we have are basically a shared sense of community. The more integrated people are, the more responsible we feel for each other and what's going on around us. We want people to not feel isolated, and we want to be able to use these tools effectively to make sure that people don't engage in domestic terrorism.
How can communities and law enforcement work collaboratively to minimize the threats of domestic terrorism?
So with working together with the community, education and awareness and intelligence sharing are like the two biggest things. So one, people have to know what to look for. They can't just see something and then say, oh, that looks a little weird. I don't really know what I'm looking at. Maybe I'll just kind of leave it alone. They need to know. But it's not only that. It's also if you educate the public on what to look for, even like not like with material goods, but with behavior, that person can feel motivated then to say, this person has been isolated, this person has been distant, let me go and check on them, or let me go report this to somewhere so someone can check on them. With information sharing, it's paramount. It's the way that policing works. Most arrests are made because the police officer either catches the person in the act or directly afterward, like within minutes. Every single minute that a cop is not called to a crime scene after a crime has been committed, the likelihood of apprehension drops pretty precipitously. Why? Because you can have the world's best detective. If they have no information, they can't do anything. Information sharing is incredibly important. So the more police, both local, federal, and state level, the quicker that they're included and with them like equipped with the best information possible, the better they will be able to do their jobs.
Last but not least, what roles can communities play in preventing radicalization and acts of domestic terrorism?
A lot of what we spoke about so far has been on the supply side of it, like basically trying to stop them once they already had their mind made up. But demand side is where the community can really come in. So if the community can basically foster this environment of inclusivity, promote dialogue, and identifying people who are at risk, a lot can be done. Because very, very often, a lot of these individuals who are captured by the ideas of committing acts of terrorism. And I don't want to make this seem like it's like a silver bullet for everything, because there are some groups that are very integrated in society and they still commit acts of terrorism. But most people, if you take care of that feeling of isolation, you can catch that person while they're in that first step of the indoctrination phase where they have a held belief, but they're not fully ingrained. You can reintegrate them, right? Get them to have a lot of different roots into the community, because the more likely they are to be engaged in the community, it lowers the likelihood of them wanting to actually damage it, commit acts of terrorism. It also helps other people keep an eye on each other too. Like I said, that idea of feeling collectively accountable for your environment seems to be the community's best tool to fight back.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.